This is not just a story, it is a mirror. A reflection that shows us where arrogance can lead a person when left unchecked. This story also teaches us that truth does not remain silent when mocked, but one day it will respond. This story is inspired by Surah Al-Masad, the surah that tells the story of the arrogant, tyrannical, and unjust man Abu Lahab. It is the message of the Quran that reminds us that wealth, pride, and hatred of religion do not bring success or honor, but rather reduce a person to ashes, both in this world and in the hereafter. The story takes place in the fictional city of Halewick, where a man named Elias Thorne rules with his wealth, pride, and cruelty. He is a man who kills the hungry, deprives the orphan of his rights, mocks the mosque, and considers the righteous servants of Allah weak. His wife Madeline is also immersed in the same poison. But truth is not just buried in history, it returns over time. And when it returns, it is in the form of fire. The whispers in the marketplace. The sky over Halewick was the color of burnt parchment, with ash swirling faintly in the summer air, though no one knew where it came from. The town, a modest cluster of weather-beaten homes and forgotten churches, had always whispered its warnings to those who listened, but pride makes men deaf. It was in this forgotten corner of the world, veiled from progress yet swollen with arrogance, that Elias Thorne had made his fortune. His emporium towered in the center of the marketplace like a monument to his ego, its tall stained glass windows blazing with reflections of fire every sunset. Elias was a man of immense stature and inflexible will, known not for charity but for the booming voice he used to crush dissent, a voice that once roared so loud in the town council that no one dared oppose his bid to tear down the orphanage to build his private library. His wife, Madeline, was no less cruel, a woman wrapped in finery whose bracelets jingled like chains, who spoke poison with a smile and poured contempt like perfume. The couple had no children, but they ruled Halewick as if it were their legacy, feeding it just enough to keep it beneath them. They mocked the believers who knelt in the old mosque near the woods, branding them fools of the past, muttering something about how light had no place where wealth ruled. But some truths remain untouched by time, and one night, truth came knocking. It began when a boy, 12, frail and shivering, was dragged into the town square after being caught stealing a loaf from Elias's store. "You want bread," Elias bellowed as he struck the boy with the flat of his hand. "Then earn it like a man." The crowd had watched silently, eyes averted, not because they agreed but because fear had long ago carved out their courage. But among them stood an old man cloaked in gray, his eyes glowing with something ancient. He stepped forward, not with anger, not with violence, but with the sadness of someone who had seen this before. "You strike the hungry," the man whispered, "yet you feed the fire that will one day devour you." Elias had laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Prophets don't wear rags," he said, "and the only fire I believe in warms my wine." The old man did not reply. He only pointed to the boy, crumpled and weeping on the ground, and said, "He will rise, you will fall, and your hands will be the reason." Then he disappeared into the crowd. From that night onward, strange things began to unravel. First, the mirrors in Elias's home stopped reflecting his image. Then the rosewood doors of his emporium refused to close at dusk, creaking open again no matter how many locks he bolted. His wife's jewelry grew warm, hot enough to blister, and yet she refused to remove them. She wore them with pride, even as red marks blossomed on her skin. One by one, the trees around their estate withered. Birds stopped singing near their window. The wind carried whispers. And then came the dreams, blistering, vivid nightmares where Elias stood in a vast desert aflame, his hands blackened and burning, unable to extinguish them no matter how much he cried. In every dream, a voice repeated the same words, "May his hands perish. May his wealth not save him." Elias laughed them off at first, mocking the clerics who warned him, burning religious leaflets that appeared on his doorstep. But laughter is loudest before the scream. And the scream came when his vault, filled with gold and deeds and the pride of a lifetime, burst into flames without a spark. Everything was reduced to ash. Fire investigators found no cause. But someone found something else. A note, untouched by the inferno, placed where the gold had been. In precise, calligraphic handwriting, it read, "What use is gold in the fire?" Then came the voices. First in his dreams. Then in the walls. Then in the mirror. Then from within his own mouth. "Tabbat yada," they chanted. "Perish the hands." It was then he began to unravel. He fired all his workers. Boarded his estate. He wore gloves, trying to cover the blackening skin on his palms that no doctor could explain. His wife, now pale and trembling, carried bundles of dry wood through the halls as if preparing for something. No one knew why. But one servant, a girl named Lila who stayed behind out of pity, saw Madeline whisper to the wood each night, as if feeding it prayers. Elias caught her once and screamed, "This is our salvation. Wood. We burn before they burn us." Lila ran. She never returned. And days later, when a postman came to deliver a letter, he found the estate burned to the ground. No bodies were found. Only a single pair of golden bangles, melted into the shape of a serpent, and a blackened pair of gloves resting atop a charred Quran, untouched by flame. The town wept, not out of sorrow, but relief. A shadow had lifted, but no one forgot the fire, and no one ever built on the ruins. Even now, if you pass Hale Wick, you'll find a field of scorched earth where nothing grows. Locals say on some nights, a faint glow rises from the ground, and if you get too close, you'll hear it. The chanting, the warning, the truth. Perish the hands that oppose the light. They said no one would build on the ruins of the Thorn estate, but greed never dies, it only changes its face. 15 years after the fire, a real estate conglomerate called Ignis Holdings purchased the land quietly, under a subsidiary name. They arrived in suits and black cars, unrolling blueprints with polished smiles, speaking of revitalization and future community housing. But the elders of Hale Wick, what few remained, stood in silence as the land was surveyed. When asked what the town thought, an old woman named Sister Miriam, her face wrinkled like forgotten parchment, answered only with, "You cannot plant flowers in a graveyard and expect them to bloom." The project began anyway. The workers were the first to notice the strange occurrences. Hammers vanished. Metal scorched palms. Fresh timber delivered in the morning was ash by afternoon. Surveillance cameras caught static during certain hours, always the same time, 3:13 a.m. One night, a security guard was found at the perimeter fence, eyes wide, lips torn by his own teeth. He could not speak again, only scribble, over and over, in shaking letters, "Burning hands, burning hands, burning hands." The corporation covered it up. Mental illness, they claimed. Occupational stress. But something had awakened, something ancient, unrepentant, and hungry. Among the new arrivals to Hale Wick was Dr. Miriam Alcott, a scholar of comparative religion and folklore. Born in London to a mixed heritage, her father Anglican, her mother a Muslim from Fez, Miriam had always walked the bridge between belief and doubt. She had come not as a believer, but as a researcher, drawn by the legend of the Curse of the Burning Palm, which she had stumbled upon in a forgotten library footnote. What intrigued her was the name mentioned in an anonymous 1912 manuscript, Lahab. Not Elias Thorn. Not even Madeline. Lahab. In Arabic, it meant flame. It was the very word used in a chapter of the Quran she barely remembered from childhood, Surah Al-Masad, where a man named Abu Lahab was cursed for his hatred of truth and the Prophet. "May his hands perish," it read, "and his wealth not avail him." As Miriam stood over the blackened soil, Whispering that verse again from memory, the wind seemed to hush. The birds fled, and the earth gave a soft, almost imperceptible shudder beneath her feet. Miriam began to dig, not with shovels, but with truth. She searched old records, interviewed elders, and followed every hidden trail the fire had tried to erase. What she uncovered chilled her more than any ghost story. Elias Thorne wasn't his birth name. In fact, he had changed it in his youth after being excommunicated from a mysterious brotherhood that sought to mimic the power of ancient scriptures for personal gain. His real name had been Eleazar al-Lahab, a direct descendant, by legend, of Abu Lahab himself. The arrogance was in his blood. And the curse? It followed the bloodline. But something deeper was at play. Elias hadn't simply inherited punishment. He had summoned it, invited it, and left behind a legacy to ensure it never slept. While researching the ruins, Miriam discovered a small cellar space beneath the estate's foundation, unmarked on any blueprint. With two local teenagers, curious and foolish, she entered it. It wasn't just a cellar. It was a ritual chamber. Candles burned in a ring, yet there was no source of heat. The air was thick with the scent of scorched skin. Symbols from Abrahamic, pagan, and forbidden texts were inscribed on the walls, but over them all, one phrase was repeated in Arabic. Yada abi lahabin watab. Perish the hands of Abu Lahab. But it wasn't written in supplication. It was scratched in rage, as if the walls themselves had tried to scream the verse. Miriam didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, because of dreams. In her sleep, a boy stood before her. Not older than the one Elias had struck in the square. But his face was ageless. Fire swirled behind his eyes. You remember me, he whispered. Your grandmother taught you the verse. Miriam nodded. Then remember this. It wasn't a story. It was a warning. When she woke, the soles of her feet were blackened as if she had walked through coal. And her hands itched with something deeper than skin. Guilt? Or transformation? She wasn't sure anymore. News broke the next morning that a man named Dorian Gray, CEO of Ignis Holdings, had gone missing in Halewick. His private office was found burned from the inside out. Nothing else in the building was touched. Not a paper, not a shelf. Only the chair in which he'd sat was reduced to ash. On his computer screen, which somehow survived, a single word was displayed. Masad. Palm fiber. The word from the Quran. The same word that described the punishment of Abu Lahab's wife. Miriam knew then this was not coincidence. Not haunting. This was divine consequence. Generation to generation. And Halewick wasn't cursed because it had forgotten truth. It was cursed because it mocked it. The whisper had returned to Halewick, not as ghost story or village myth, but as breath on every windowpane, a presence in every unlit corner. Miriam Olcott no longer walked freely. Since the cellar discovery, something had attached itself to her, not like a demon, but like a debt long overdue. The dreams grew darker. In one, she walked barefoot on a road of glowing embers, her feet blistered and raw. Beside her walked a veiled woman, hands wrapped in scorched rope. He hated the light, the woman hissed, and I fed his fire. Miriam would wake gasping, her wrists aching, red lines encircling them like invisible coils. She was being marked. In the scripture, Abu Lahab's wife was condemned to carry firewood, with a rope of palm fiber around her neck. But Miriam now understood. The wood wasn't symbolic. It was fuel. Not for a worldly flame, but for the kind that burns in both worlds. A fire that prideful hands ignite, and those closest to them carry. Miriam went back to the cellar. She had to know more. Alone this time. The chamber beneath the ruins had changed. The air trembled like water over a buried volcano. The walls bled soot. In the center, where candles had once stood, a new shape had formed. A noose made from woven palm strands, resting atop a blackened ledger. When she picked it up, her fingers stung, not from heat, but from memory. The ledger contained names. Dozens. Hundreds. Men and women from Halewick and beyond, each marked by the same sin. They had profited from others' ruin. Politicians. Tycoons. Preachers in gold-threaded robes. Their lives, according to the scribbled records, ended not in peace, but in fire, madness, or disgrace. Each one bore the same unseen scar. They had ignored the cry of the poor. They had ridiculed the sacred. They had mocked the warning. They had laughed at Tabbat Yada. Miriam's hand trembled as she turned the last page. At the bottom, not written but carved into the paper, was her own name. Dr. Miriam Alcott. Witness. Her breath caught. She hadn't hurt anyone. She hadn't raised her voice against Scripture. Had she? But memory is a blade with a hidden edge. She remembered debates in university lounges, mocking religious texts as primitive poetry. She remembered silences when charity was needed. She remembered pride. The rope of palm fiber was not just for the cruel. It was for the complicit. The room darkened, and then it spoke. A voice. Male. Timeless. Would you burn with them, or break the chain? Miriam fell to her knees, her heart thundering. What do you want from me? She screamed into the black. No one escapes the fire, the voice answered. But some warn others from falling in. Then the walls shook, and light flooded the room. Not fire, but soft, golden light, as if dawn had cracked the bones of the earth. The rope vanished. The ledger crumbled to dust. And she was alone again. When she returned to town, the skies had darkened. A storm brewed not with rain, but with ash. Halewick was evacuating. Tremors had spread. Birds flew low. Dogs howled without reason. People wept in the streets. The earth knew what men refused to admit. Judgment had begun. But Miriam had changed. Her fear was now purpose. She stood on the very spot where Elias Thorne had struck that orphan boy years ago and called out, not with a loudspeaker, but with her voice, steady and raw. You mocked the words that could have saved you, but he is still merciful. Some listened. Most did not. And that night, the fire came, not from above, but from beneath. A crack tore the earth where the estate had once stood. Flames licked the clouds, but they were not ordinary flames. They bore no smoke, no scream. They burned like justice. They moved like prophecy. And every house that had profited from Elias Thorne's reign, every shop that turned the hungry away, every mansion built on crushed prayer, was swallowed. But Miriam stood untouched, because in her hands was no ledger, only a Quran. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't need to. The words glowed in her heart now. The curse had passed her. She had chosen not to carry the firewood. Halewick was quiet after the flames, but it was not peace that settled over it. It was reverence. Something ancient had passed through, something too holy for science and too terrible for legends. And though the sky returned to blue and the birds began again to sing, those who lived through it could never forget the soundless scream that had rung through the soul of the town. It hadn't been the scream of a man. It had been the scream of consequence, a scream carried on the breath of justice, echoing still in the bones of the very land. Dr. Miriam Alcott had changed forever. She no longer lectured in stone lecture halls or wrote academic papers to be read by indifferent scholars. Her heart had turned from theory to truth, from skepticism to surrender. She moved into a modest home beside the ruins of the old masjid, where the ground still carried warmth from the fire, as though the divine flame had left behind not destruction, but instruction. She taught the children of the town, not science alone but awe, and not just awe but humility. She told them that pride blinds more surely than darkness, and that there are verses which speak louder than thunder if we dare to listen. But Miriam knew the work was not over. Because fire remembers, and arrogance, it never dies quietly. From the ruins of Halewick, news spread across the internet. A few photographs, smuggled out by travelers, made their way to larger cities. Images of scorched fields that glowed faintly at night, of ropes charred but never fully consumed. Paranormal websites labeled it the Halewick Hell Zone. A famous YouTuber who came to explore the site vanished after filming his opening scene. His last words caught on camera: "This is where the rich guy burned alive, right? Let's poke around." And then static. Miriam warned those who came. Some listened. Others laughed. She had learned something few dared to believe. The curse of Abu Lahab, the fire prepared for the arrogant, was not confined to scripture or story. It was living law, woven into the moral fabric of the universe, like gravity or death. And when enough injustice stacked itself high, when enough mockery echoed in the face of truth, the flame did not wait for the afterlife. It came. In the 4th year after the fire, a young corporate mogul named Raymond Coyle arrived in Halewick. He wore a silver suit and a smirk, spoke about turning the ruins into a luxury spa retreat with spiritual fire therapy. He offered money, bags of it. No one in the town would sell. He laughed and built anyway, importing machines, cranes, steel. A monument to ego rising again where justice had once walked. Miriam pleaded, "This land is marked. This isn't a warning anymore. It's memory. You're building on punishment." He dismissed her. "You sound like Elias Thorne's ghost." She replied softly, "I am the ghost of the boy he struck." That night, a tremor shook the town. No fire. Not yet. But in the morning, Raymond's hands were blistered, bleeding through his silk gloves. His reflection disappeared from all mirrors. The machinery rusted within hours. The ground rejected cement like a body rejecting poison. But Raymond stayed, defiant. 1 week later, his entire estate, barely finished, was found as black glass. His body was never recovered. Just a trail of rope fibers, still smoking, leading out of the master bedroom window. Miriam closed her eyes when she heard, not in triumph, but in sorrow, because she had come to understand something more frightening than death. Fire does not forget the blood it smells. And that fire had a name. Not a human name. Not even Elias Thorne. But the name whispered through generations. The name burned into the skin of every tyrant who raised his hand against the truth. The name cursed not by men but by the Creator himself. Lahab. The flame. And that flame still waits, quiet, patient, coiled in the space between a cruel act and its retribution. It is there in every unjust strike, in every mocking tongue, in every silence where a voice should have spoken for the innocent. But so is mercy. And Miriam, before her death, wrote a single sentence, on parchment, in ink mixed with ash, and placed it at the center of the rebuilt masjid for all who entered. It read, "A fire awaits the hand that strikes truth, but light surrounds the hand that lifts it." She died in prayer. No one saw her go. But on the night she passed, the sky over Halewick burned gold for 3 minutes, and every window lit with warmth. Not heat, not terror, just warmth. And from the hills, a whisper rose one last time. "Perish the hands, but save the soul."